This is Entrepreneurs Get Visible, the podcast for people who want more impact, influence, and income. I'm Anna Parker-Naples, and I'll be sharing with you proven methods from leading entrepreneurs that help you get visible as an authority in your field. Because anything's possible when you get visible. Hello and welcome to Entrepreneurs Get Visible. I am joined today by James Cridland, who is the editor of Podnews, which is a daily podcast newsletter. Although these days, I guess we refer to them as e-newsletters because they don't come through the post. And is also the host of Podland, which again is a bite-sized bulletin of what's going on in the podcasting industry. And James, you are a radio futurologist. So we are today going to be getting into where this mammothly growing industry is going. So hey, James, and welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for asking.
So you have quite an illustrious career in radio and audio. So just tell us a little bit about how you've ended up being the person bringing the podcast news to everyone podcasting. How have you ended up at that route?
Well, I don't know whether it's an illustrious career, but I've got a background in radio. So I worked in radio in the UK for a long, long time. So you can tell from my ridiculous British accent. Not that there's anything wrong with a British accent, Anna.
Of course not. James is coming to us live from Brisbane. And he's just given me the news that they had a 3-day lockdown. So I'm a little bit jealous of that, given that ours seems to have gone on for 9 months.
Yes. It's a touchy subject. Anyway. So I worked in radio in the north of England in the UK and then in London as well for quite some time, working at radio stations like Virgin Radio and the BBC, and, very much enjoyed my time there. One of the things I did when I was working at Virgin Radio in January of 2005 is I launched what I think was probably the first daily podcast from a radio station back then. Wow. Which was quite good fun. And so that was way before even podcasts were in the iPod, for example.
So that's really early days. That's when everything was done on the RSS feed alone.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and so you had to copy and paste an RSS feed into a piece of software called Juice Podder or iPodder. And so it was all very early days, but great fun and really interesting. So very much enjoyed that. And then worked at the BBC for a while, and then started being a consultant for all kinds of radio stations and audio companies across the world. And started producing Podnews, which is a daily podcast newsletter, which is free. You can get it now at podnews.net. Started writing that in the middle of 2017, assuming that this would be something, additional that I could do while I was also doing radio consulting work, not really expecting that there'd be a massive pandemic in 2020 and all of my radio consulting work would disappear.
I think last year threw a few spanners in the works, but what must be exciting for you is that you've now put yourself right at the heart of that podcasting industry, and you are a radio futurologist. I can't even say the word futurologist. Did you see what? Did you anticipate what was the incredible growth that we're having? At what point did that become obvious, or didn't it?
Well, I think one of the things that I was talking around an awful lot in the late 2000s was that radio was multi-platform. It wasn't an AM/FM medium anymore. Radio and audio was going to be delivered in all sorts of different ways. And part of that way is new forms of broadcasting, which exist in places like the UK with something called DAB, and in places like the US with satellite broadcasting and HD. But I was also talking about the benefits of on-demand, because on-demand audio is a really important thing. It's a thing. If you just bear in mind that the most committed listener to the radio listens for about 2.5 hours every day, which essentially means that 21 hours, 22 hours of all of the broadcasting that we do in radio isn't heard by that person. You could frankly get away with just 2 hours. So I thought that was really interesting, and pulling together what on-demand audio could actually do was, I thought, clearly going to be a part of where the future of audio is going. And it is, certainly part of where the future is going. Radio is still very large, very well listened to and everything else. But, clearly that's one of those, things, I guess.
I think in many ways, audio's been almost ahead of the curve in going on demand. We're seeing it now happen with our TV. I mean, this was the first Christmas where I didn't buy the Radio Times, the bumper Christmas edition, because frankly, I don't know when I last even consumed television other than to watch the occasional episode of EastEnders at 8:00 on a Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. So in many ways, we seem to have moved over. The listener behaviour is expecting that we can listen to what we want when we want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, so we've moved from 20 years ago of essentially watching live radio, listening to live TV, to now where we're consuming an awful lot of on-demand media, whether that's on-demand TV, on-demand radio, and podcasting, of course, which isn't quite the same as on-demand radio.
What are the differences there? What are the differences there for you? How do you see the differences between on-demand radio and on-demand podcasts?
I mean, I think quite a lot of it is, so I have a definition of radio, which is a shared experience with a human connection. And that's what radio really is. It's a human being connecting with you, sharing experiences with you. But radio is different to podcasting in that radio, it's called broadcasting for a reason. You're trying to broadcast, to cast your programming to as many people as you possibly can, to a broad audience, because that's how radio makes its money. Podcasting is rather different because podcasting really focuses on niche. It focuses on a particular audience. So there's an audience out there, I was joking the other day on Facebook when I was trying to explain this, and I was saying, that there will be an audience for people who like to knit underwater. Probably won't be a very large audience, but nevertheless.
I don't think I'll be listening to that particular podcast either.
But if you are the only person who is producing a podcast about underwater knitting, then any advertiser that wants to reach underwater knitters with their new clever
wool,
waterproof wool, any advertiser that wants to reach those will be going to you and will be paying a lot of money to do that. So actually, a lot of this comes down to niche and making sure that you are super serving that particular part of your audience. That's very different to radio broadcasting, because radio broadcasting, you just want to reach as many people as possible.
So in terms of podcasting then, what do you see are the pitfalls for someone wanting to start their own podcast?
Oh, I mean, one of the pitfalls of somebody wanting to start their own podcast is making it sound too complicated so that people don't start their own podcasts. I mean, that's one of the start. But I think, if you look at podcasting, if you look at the benefits of what podcasting offers, the pitfalls are really not thinking enough about what you're going to do and producing something which is fine interviewing lots of people who you really want to talk to. But if you haven't thought about why you're interviewing, what your audience wants, who you're doing it for, then that's a different conversation.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I've talked about this to you before. I started my first podcast not really thinking about it, just thinking I was going to have some great conversations. And why would someone tune in when there are so many hours and hours and hours of content that they could consume elsewhere? You've got to be really purposeful with that.
I mean, there are 1.8 million podcasts out there now, and the research still says that the majority of people listen to 3 podcasts a week or fewer. So, you need to make sure that you are one of those 3. And that's a very difficult job. But nevertheless, making sure that you do that job and do that job well, it means that you can get there. Yeah.
So you are charting and tracking what's going on in podcast land. And that is actually, I should mention, that's the name of your podcast. So anyone who wants to go over and listen, he's had a really great guest on just this week, I believe, on episode 6. If you want to go and find that, I was interviewed by James just a few weeks before Christmas. What do you see coming? We've obviously had tremendous growth, particularly since the strike of the pandemic, the early pandemic back in March 2020. Tremendous growth. What's coming now? What's the next wave?
Yeah, and I should also say, by the way, that I also do a podcast version of Podnews as well, which you can ask your smart speaker for or find in any podcast app store. I think, where I think podcasting is going is we've seen an awful lot of consolidation over the last couple of years. We've seen Spotify jumping in and buying all sorts of people. Amazon, just before the end of the year, ended up buying Wondery, which is a big podcast company. And, Amazon are very clearly in this game as well. Other large broadcasters in the US have also bought a lot of podcasting, both technology as well as content. So there's clearly an awful lot of consolidation going on, and clearly a lot of money being pumped into this industry. And I think that's great for all of us, because actually, if you're a single podcaster, as I am from this office, then actually, I can reach the same audience as these larger podcast companies are. And so as they grow the industry, we all stand to benefit out of that. So I think that's a great thing. But I think what we're also seeing is a change in how podcasters can earn revenue from this if they so want to. Lots more companies being established which will help with connecting podcasters with advertisers, with sponsors, with affiliates, but also podcasters now have it easier than ever to do things like Patreon and memberships and Memberful and all of those companies that would help you produce a membership for your podcast so you're not reliant on ad dollars. So there's a whole bunch of that stuff going on. And then, of course, you can have a look at some of the podcasts who are doing their shows as live stage shows, selling merch, turning their podcast into books. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And I think that that's really interesting and a good omen into where the future of podcasting is going. Because once you've got an industry which is financially stable, which has lots of different ways of earning revenue, not just advertising, then I think that that's a fantastic step forward. And I think, you and I particularly, when we grew up, 50% of the media that we consumed, or probably even more of that, was commercial free, had no advertising in there, because we're both British.
Well, I can remember when Channel 4 came out, and that was quite exciting to have a fourth channel to choose from.
Oh, fourth channel. I remember watching the very exciting test card and thinking that this was going to be something else. So that was a real change. And I think, the North American and, to be honest, the Australian view of advertising is very different. That most of Europe is much less comfortable with large amounts of advertising being thrown into the media that they consume. And I think that's probably really good for podcasting, because we have so many other ways of doing that too.
And the element of, it doesn't necessarily, as a host, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have adverts and sponsorship on your content, but that you are talking like, so today, we've talked about go and listen to this podcast, which is then a funnel for your business. We talk about things on my podcast, which are a funnel for my business. And I think a podcast can be a really powerful front end. While I've got you here, James, I'd really like to get your thoughts on why these big companies are ploughing so much cash into this industry. Why is that happening? Why are we suddenly seeing Spotify and Amazon wanting to kind of play the game alongside Apple?
Well, so I think, there's a number of different reasons for that. Let's have a look at, Amazon's purchase of Wondery is interesting, because what they've got with Wondery is they've got a company which has a lot of formats, a lot of different podcasts which they have made, which they are now selling to other people. So if you live in Japan, you can listen to Business Wars in Japanese. If you are in the United Arab Emirates, you can listen to an Arabic version of Business Wars, which they are working with local media companies on. So all of a sudden you're seeing, there's a bunch of different formats there that this company owns. They also, of course, own the TV rights, and Amazon happens to run a very popular Amazon Prime video service, which of course they need content for. So you've got that sort of side of it as well. And I think what Wondery have done very cleverly is that they've also understood that there's life outside of North America, and that there's all kinds of things that they can earn from in terms of other countries too. So, they have a joint venture in the UK with Stitcher, so that they're actually talking to advertisers in the UK. They work with a company in Australia called Ranieri & Co. So they've done all of this hard work that Amazon, frankly, haven't done yet. So there's a real opportunity there, I think, for Amazon to, with the purchase of Wondery, really leapfrog into both earning significant money from their podcasting work, but also understanding, well, what else does this mean for the Amazon business, for the video? for the books and everything else. Oh, yeah. And of course, there's Audible too. Audible is a really good and clever mechanism for Amazon to sell audio in a way that, obviously Amazon Podcasts and Amazon Music don't do. So, so again, I think, it was a very clever purchase. The reason why Spotify is jumping into it is probably twofold. They need to earn more money. And one of the ways that they can earn more money is to sell advertising inside podcasts, which you get even if you're a Spotify premium user. So that's one easy way. But I think the other way is more of an esoteric way. It's that if lots of people are using Spotify to consume podcasts and not music, then they can go back to the music companies and say, we're currently paying you 65% of our income. It turns out that 20% of all of the time spent on Spotify is now spent listening to podcasts. So we're not going to pay you for that. So we'll just halve our money to you by a fifth. Is that okay?
All about the money. All about the money.
Could well do that. I mean, the interesting thing, if they were going to do that, is that they have already released some research showing that podcasts don't take listening time away from music. It's mostly additive. So maybe they won't be arguing that. But it would be a clever plan. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting way into the future. But they very much see themselves as being an audio company who want to be there for audio and don't necessarily care what that audio is. And if it happens to be cheaper audio for them to get hold of than music, well, great.
What are your thoughts then on the celebrity-driven audio exclusives that they're doing over on Spotify? So we've recently had Joe Rogan, which got a lot of press because it was the biggest podcast deal, although his show was actually originally a YouTube show. So where's the line with podcasting? And then we've had Meghan and Harry start their audio-only Archwell audio over on Spotify.
Yes.
What's your thought? Yeah. Do you think we're going to see more of that?
I mean, I guess so. I would rather hope not. I think one of the things that drives me a little bit mad about some of the shows that you see promoted, not just on Spotify, but on some of these other networks is, it's a big name. And then it's, with no hold barred conversations with their showbiz friends. And at the end of the day, it comes back to niche. There will be an audience for people who want to listen to Hannah Montana, talking to some of her friends. But there won't be a very big one. And I worry whether that is, it's sort of celebrity guff that it doesn't necessarily excite me that much. So that's a bit of a worry. And it's interesting. You look at Spotify, and clearly their plan is that they need to sign up things that aren't just 6 episodes long. They need to sign up things which are going to last for 2 years, 3 years. Joe Budden was the first big podcast that Spotify signed up. He had to publish every single week. His contract didn't give him a vacation time, more the fool for signing something like that. But that was done deliberately to keep those numbers up. And so if you're looking at, beautifully crafted short form content that only lasts for 6 or 7 or 8 episodes, you may have heard of Serial, for example, or S-Town, 2 great examples of that genre have no place on Spotify because they're not long enough. They're not big enough for Spotify to actually see that they can earn money out of. Yeah.
And they're powerful. Clever, creative parts of audio. And I think that's one of the things I really love about audio is, so yes, I talk to people particularly in the entrepreneurship space wanting to build personal brands, but there's this whole other vast catalogue of creative audio pieces, dramatic pieces, fun, comedy, and there's so much wealth out there. So going forward now, we are recording this at the beginning of 2021. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of years in terms of the podcasting space?
I mean, all kinds of things that we've got no idea. But I think one of the things is going to be Apple will either change what it's doing or will just fall asleep. Apple has had a really interesting relationship with podcasting over the last 15 or so years, where it has essentially been the de facto leader in this space because there's an Apple podcast app on Apple phones and there isn't one on Android phones, even though 80% of the world uses Android phones. So Apple has essentially been the market leader in that. And also Apple has essentially run the entire industry because if you look at almost all of the other big podcast apps, excepting Spotify and Amazon, they all get their lists of podcasts from Apple. Apple has an open API to allow you to get those lists. So that's, slightly unhealthy. And my concern is that Apple hasn't really innovated in the last 10, 15 years in terms of podcasting. And I'm just a little bit worried that they have taken their foot off the gas. So it's actually quite useful to have companies like Spotify and Amazon, jump in and go, well, great, we'll do new and interesting things. There is also another group of people, the independent podcast developers and hosts, who are, increasingly coalescing around Adam Curry, who is a MTV DJ back in the day. But he was one of the people who essentially invented podcasting. And he invented podcasting 20 years ago this month, which is an amazing thing. And so he has now realized that there's problems with Apple being in charge of everything, because Apple gets rid of podcasts that they don't like. And he's also worried about, the fact that Apple haven't really innovated. And so he's working on something that he's rather grandly calling Podcasting 2.0, which is a ton of additional technical work into podcasting. So you can actually start saying where a podcast is about and who is in a podcast and how you can pay for this podcast and all of this kind of stuff, and building it into cryptocurrency and everything else. And that is, I think, beginning to get quite some momentum going in terms of the other people who are beginning to be involved in that. So my suspicion is that we will see less of Apple's leadership in this and a bit more from other people. To me, it would be brilliant if we were at a stage where Apple was about a third of all podcast listening, Spotify was about a third of all podcast listening, and everybody else was about a third of all podcast listening, because then everybody would be fighting and battling.
You need that. You need to have that.
Exactly. I mean, it's great for the podcaster, and it's also great actually for the industry. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're a business person, the thing that will spur you on more than anything else is competition, is other people getting close to what you're doing things in a slightly different way that you can learn from. And everybody sort of, a rising tide gathers all boats. Everybody sees and moves and makes sure that everything works.
And so has to make things sharper, has to make the product sharper.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that all of that is good. And I think that competition in any field is very useful and very helpful. So I'm looking forward to seeing that being a thing, certainly in the next 3 or 4 years. And, and you can well see that Spotify could go one of two ways. It could either become this great big walled garden where nobody else is allowed in and, and stops using RSS and starts using something else. Or Spotify could actually be part of the resurgence of interest in innovation in the podcasting space. And I think, what excited me at the end of last year was seeing Spotify launching this thing that they call shows with music. And
crazy.
Some of the old guard would say, well, it's not really a podcast. And it's not really a podcast, but it allows the likes of you and me to, if we choose to, sit down and play some of our favorite music, which is something that we've never been able to legally do before in terms of on-demand content. And just sort of seeing Spotify playing around with that, and it's very clunky, and it has to be because of the licensing deals that they have with the music companies and everything else. But the fact that they are doing it, the fact that they are moving forward on that is, I think, really good news for where we might be going in the future.
I think that's interesting because particularly podcasters who are doing it for personal brand reasons, that know, like, and trust factor that's so important to build your tribe, to find your listeners. Music's such a fundamental part of our lives and our stories and our own back catalogues, that if we can share that with people, I think it can accelerate, depending on how you bring the music into your show, I think it can accelerate that feeling of bond and connection. So James, as we kind of close out the show, what's the question I've not asked you about where podcasting is going?
That's a great question.
It's a great question.
Yes, because it gets me to thinking, I wonder where we are. I mean, I think what I find really interesting is that when I got into this and started writing Podnews 2.5 years ago. One of the pieces of thinking that I was doing around how to do this newsletter was essentially to work it out to cut as many corners as I possibly could and launch a product which I knew would be a good product, but a product that I didn't necessarily, that wasn't going to be as polished as some of the things that I've done previously. So a real, MVP, a minimal viable product. And I think, one of the things that I've learned over the more than 2.5 years since I've been writing it is just slow and incremental improvements to what you do all the time, and consistently looking at what you're doing and making sure that it's, hopefully a good product is really useful. And so I think I'd say, to anybody doing a podcast is listen to other podcasts. Number one. You'd be surprised.
I would be surprised. The amount of people say, I've launched a podcast, but I've never listened to one.
Yes, brilliant.
How are you going to know what you're doing? How are you going to know how to improve? How are you going to know what you're missing?
So certainly number one is listen to other people. Make sure that you are better than them. Listen to other people, ideally alongside you in the car as you drive somewhere, and go, oh, why does mine sound worse or better than the other one, and all of that. So I think that's really handy. But on the other side, I would say don't wait. Get something out there, because the only way that you will learn how to do something is to get something out there. If I can tell you a dull and tedious story about...
I love a dull and tedious story.
about the classified advertising on Podnews. So there's classified advertising in there. It's the third, after the third story down, there's a little block of advertising, which is incredibly cheap, $34 at the moment. But the reason why it's there is I thought to myself, right, I think classified podcasting probably won't work, but I'll give it a go anyway. And I came up with a pricing structure, which you can have a look at if you want to go and have a play with it. But I thought to myself, right, I've done this sort of thing in previous things that I have done online. So I'm going to set myself a limit of, because I do all the code for the website as well, I'm going to set myself a limit of 1 day. And I'm going to write all of the classified ad system in 1 day. And so there was lots that didn't work. So if you forgot your password, for example, then you got a screen that said, oh, you've forgotten your password. We haven't written this bit yet. You'll have to email us. So, I literally cut as many corners as I possibly could to get something that was ready, that I could actually put it live after 1 day and go, okay, well, let's see what happens. And I bet it won't work. And I bet, it was a waste of time, but at least I've only wasted 1 day. The benefit of Australia is I go to sleep, everybody else wakes up. So the next morning, I looked in my email box, and I had a customer that hadn't just spent the $24 I think I was asking at the time. I had a customer that had bought $500 worth of advertising.
Money while you sleep, James. Money while you sleep.
And I thought to myself, oh, maybe I should make it look nice now, add a style sheet, make it look smart, So, I mean, and the same goes for if you're doing a show. Please don't overthink it. Please don't spend 6 months working out what your opening music is going to be. You can do all of that in episode 2, 3, 4, and 5. The best way of making a really cogent product, and I make a podcast every single day, the best way of making a really consistent product is just to make it. So don't waste time. Just go for it.
Take the action. Learn from your mistakes, because you will make them no matter what you're doing, whether it's a product, a podcast, anything. But you can't be streets ahead of everybody else if you're procrastinating at the back of the queue. So, thank you so much for joining us today, James. I think that there is so much scope for growth. We've seen so many more people listening, so many more people podcasting. And I think that makes this an exciting place rather than something that is saturated. By no means is this market saturated yet. Maybe in 2 years, maybe in 3 years, maybe way beyond that. But because we're talking about niche, if you are putting out great content and you know why and you're purposeful, then you can have so much more impact.
I would completely agree with that. And I would just say, in the UK and in most places in Europe, 1 out of 5 people listens to a podcast every week. That is a big number, but that also means that 4 out of 5 people don't yet.
And people still haven't even heard
an opportunity.
Some people don't even know what a podcast is, which I'm kind of shocked by. And horrified.
What an opportunity. opportunity. If you're in the industry now, what an opportunity for where the future might be.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Take care.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Entrepreneurs Get Visible. To get your free checklist on how to raise your profile and to find out about our community, go to annaparkernaples.co.uk/get visible.